what I'm going to tell you today is probably a bit different than what many other people would tell you, though Daniel actually said a bit of what I was going to tell you about, which is I'm going to tell you that you have to take ownership of science. Like usually the way it works is I own science, right? I'm the scientist, I own it. And you're kind of using me in some way. No, I don't, I'm going to tell you that's not going to work. It's not going to work well at all. And I've had 30 years of experience to tell you that that doesn't work as well as the situation in which you have ownership of science. And so therefore, that's critical for science, for you to advance public policies. But it's also critical, by the way, though I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, for advancing science. Okay. Now, what's happening right now, not just here, but all over the world, is that governments are facing, especially those people who have to do things in government, are facing a crisis. The crisis is that there's less and less money most of the time. How many times does someone come to you and say, oh, don't worry, as much money as you need? But over the last 10 years, government officials have become more and more concerned that the way you spend their money is going to be efficient and it's going to be effective. And let me give you an example. The General Accounting Office in the United States, for example, issued a statement saying that it's no longer going to fund large programs unless there's rigorous evidence, experimental evidence, that those programs can work. In Israel recently, I was invited by the Joint Distribution Committee, which is one of the major funders or works with the government in funding social welfare, and their funders are saying to them, well, do you have evidence that your programs work? Do you have evidence that your programs are efficient? So anyone, and there are a lot of people who are a lot younger than me in this audience, you guys are facing a world in which you're constantly going to be asked, is it efficient and is it effective? When I went to the JDC, the person there who was running this organization, it's not like she really wanted this, I think. She had no choice. In other words, she came to me because the donors were telling her, we're not going to continue this way anymore. And I think that is happening all over the world, wherever you go, at least in countries that are trying to advance in a reasonable way, certainly in most Western countries. Now, science can provide an answer to the crises that people are facing, because it's really about that kind of set of answers that you're looking for. Now, you're talking about impact evaluation, but science can also provide the data and theory for deciding on what programs you want to develop. Here's a kind of conundrum. Recently, the director of the office, I'm an advisor on an advisory board for the American government for the Office of Justice Programs of the Department of Justice. And the head of the department said to three of us, or four of us on the phone, yeah, but it can't just be that I'm funding programs that have experimental impact evidence, because how will you ever develop a new program, right? If you need impact evaluations, lots of them, to fund a program, then how do you develop it? Because science, you might say, is about a bunch of issues, and I'll talk about this later. But the first thing science can tell you, science is about providing you with the information. Daniel used this idea before. Information is crucial. It provides you with the information to understand the problem. And it may provide you with theories of change that allow you to develop new programs. Now, obviously, you don't develop a new program and institute it all across your country without evidence, strong impact evaluation evidence. But there's also a science about the data and theory that will help you develop new programs. Now, what you're focusing on today is the role of impact evaluations. Very strong evaluation designs that you can believe. What does this really mean? I like to use the term believability. Can I believe from this evaluation that that program actually does have an impact? Believability is the key, okay? But in any event, an important aspect of science is providing you with the tools so you can get believable answers. Now, you know already that the tool that provides the most believable answers in science evaluation are randomized experiments. But nonetheless, overall science provides you with a set of tools to help you understand what those impacts are. If you think, by the way, in a type of progression, you start with some theories, you start with some experience in the field, you start with some data, and you develop some ideas and might try out a program on a small scale. You might do an impact evaluation of that program on a small scale. You might then bring it to a larger scale and conduct a larger evaluation. Now, science also does something very important in today's age of government officials telling you all the time, we don't have a lot of money, how can we do it? How can we do it for cheaper? How can we do it for less? We can't just spend money all over the place, because science can tell you what are the programs that work, how much do they cost, are they cost effective, and importantly, what are the programs that are most efficient and cost effective for you? In other words, you can walk into the office of the governor and say, look, these programs will give us X, will give us some outcome at some value. They are very cost effective. We ought to move with these programs. So they provide us a method for deciding how we can develop programs, how we can develop governmental or advanced governmental goals in a way that is most efficient, that doesn't waste resources. And wasting resources, I'm sure you know, is not a good word today in government. By the way, in the US 20 years ago or so, some new person would come into a role, they'd go out and they'd set some program, they'd spend money, there'd be no evidence. Quite often things would be criticized afterwards, etc. This is happening much, much less frequently today. There are agencies in government, in some countries it might be in the Treasury, in others it's in the US it's in the General Accounting Office, that are holding you accountable. People are holding you accountable. Now let me say that science can also provide something else, which can provide you a method for showing that government is succeeding. Right? I mean, science can give you a method to walk, when the guy from the newspaper walks in and says, you say, I know it in my stomach that it works. That's not going to work really well. But if you say, we have a multi-center clinical trial in the field, that trial shows there's a 20% reduction in recidivism, my area is crime, then you have something that allows you to show with strong evidence that it works. I think this is becoming, by the way, a very important issue. The idea that being able to show, because it's not just that you're learning about this, many other people in government are learning about the ideas of evidence. This is a movement that's penetrating, in Israel, for example, the Treasury is becoming a major force. The Treasury, they're mostly economists, and they are becoming very, very concerned about the idea of impact evaluations. Okay, but the key is, I told you at the beginning, for all this to happen, for you to get all these good things of being able to be effective, being able to be efficient, being able to show that you're not wasting money, to act in a scientific way, and to show your science to the public, or show your effectiveness to the public, your policymakers and practitioners, in my view, are going to have to take ownership of science. Now, normally at this point, the academics in the audience throw oranges at me or something, because they say, you want to give to the policymakers and practitioners ownership of science? Are you crazy? I'll get to that in a minute. I don't think so. As you'll see, I'm talking about co-ownership. But anyway, this ownership issue is important. So here's what I'm going to do in the 35 or 40 minutes I have left. First of all, I'm going to define to you what I mean by ownership. I don't expect you all to become scientists, okay? So let me tell you what I mean by ownership. Then I'm going to show you the danger, through an example in crime research or in the area of crime interventions, of what happens when you use the sort of previous dominant model, which I often call the clinical experience model of developing innovation. My stomach tells me so model, if you like, to some degree. I'm going to show you how that can lead to very bad decision making. Then I'm going to show you an example of an evidence-based model that has seems to follow the idea of finding out something is effective and then developing it in the field. But I'm not going to leave you there, because if I left you there, that's the typical place to leave you. If I left you there, you'd say, ooh, the clinical experience model, that's bad. You need real science, scientific evidence. And you'd say, oh, you know, the evidence-based model is good. Let's go get some evidence creators, and they will come in and solve all our problems. I'm going to show you that there are dangers that occur if you utilize the evidence-based model, but you fail to take ownership of science, which involves, by the way, Daniel used the term knowledge before. A key to this idea is knowledge. Okay, what is ownership? First of all, there are other owners of science. I'm not saying that you are the only people that own science. Some academics, this is also developed in a paper that Peter Nayrud from the UK and I have written for the Harvard Executive Session in policing. It's called police science. But we got a lot of people, academics, saying, what do you mean giving ownership? Well, it's not like we're giving ownership over to practitioners and policymakers, but practitioners and policymakers are one important owner of science. You guys have a stake in this. In the bank, I'm sure you talk about ownership, that people that have a stake in what's going on. You have a stake. Ownership means you have a say, right? And that ownership comes with others. Academics, of course. Scientists have an ownership issue. Our lives are often developed on the basis of scientific contributions, etc. The public also has an ownership role of science. In the end, what's happening is happening to them. So there may be many owners. The newspapers, of course, are all the time trying to exert some ownership over these kinds of issues. But a key issue is that you have ownership. You're one of the owners of this enterprise. And that means you have to be a key player, right? Being a key player means you're not on the sidelines. That's where I'm going to tell you about an experiment I ran in Dallas, Texas, where the Police Foundation came in and did something, and the department was sort of just doing what they were told in some sense. I'm going to tell you why just doing what you're told doesn't lead to the best outcomes. Now, ownership has responsibility. And the responsibility here is that you must become committed to science and its values. Being committed to science and its values has two elements. One is you need to recognize that science is useful, right? I mean, one attitude, I once sat in a meeting where someone presented data on traffic accidents to a government minister. And they presented the data, and in the end, the government minister looked up and said, I don't think so. My gut tells me that's not right. Right? Now, that's not a commitment to science. Now, today, it's hard to get away with this type of thing, I would say. Then maybe you could. He was the minister, of course. But the point is that you have to have a commitment to science. You have to say to yourself, this is valuable to us. It's as valuable as all these other issues that go into the politics of making decision in governments. It also means you have to be committed to the values of science. See, here's the fox and the chicken coop issue. Well, if we give the policymakers ownership, co-ownership, then they're going to try to get the answers they want. And they're going to fudge the data. And they're going to do this and they're going to do that, right? Well, if you have real ownership of science, you become committed to the values of science. How do you know when academics come up and present data they haven't fudged those data? Do you sit there and say, are they fudging the data? Now, the truth is we should all be a bit suspicious of everything all the time. You want to make sure, you want to look carefully, you want to have the data reanalyzed, etc. But the point is that to be frank, scientists ought to be worried more about scientists, in my view. There is fraud in science as well. But in any case, the reason we're not as worried is because part of giving the right answers. But you know, the truth is, this is not such a hard issue. Don't you want the right answers? If you get the wrong answer, and then you go out and implement that program across the country, and it fails, that's terrible, right? So the truth here, getting the right answer is key to what you're doing. So there are three key elements to this ownership of science idea. The first is valuing science and its potential contributions to government, right? In order for this to work, you have to say science is important. Impact evaluations are important. You have to, in that sense, have the knowledge and understanding of what they're going to supply for you. And that also means, as I've said, that you have to value the norms of science. You have to take that on. You have to understand them. You don't just change things along the way. You establish a process at the beginning of how you're going to evaluate something, and then you follow it through. Okay? Those are the values of science. But you also have knowledge about the scientific enterprise, and that's what you're gaining here. Right? You're gaining here knowledge about science. How does an impact evaluation work? Why is one type of impact evaluation better than another? How do I do these things? Well, that's the science. And finally, you have to take a leadership role in science. Ownership requires involvement and activity. You have to become part of that enterprise. Sometimes scientists may not really get what you really need. You have to go out there and be part of that process. Okay, let's start out. Let's go back a bit. So what's the problem with just using the clinical experience model? In the clinical experience model, you develop innovation and diffuse it primarily on the basis of the experiences and opinions of practitioners. The chief of police says, this really works. I've been going out in the field, it seems to me it really works. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that clinical experience is not valuable. Clinical experience is very valuable, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. But a situation in which you make decisions about whether you should innovate, create a new program, or whether you should expand that program across a wide jurisdiction, making that on the basis of your gut feelings or sense of experience, etc., only is a significant problem. And Steve Mostrovsky, a colleague of mine at George Mason, wrote in a paper a few years ago that the further diffusion of innovations among the vast majority of police organizations depends upon them becoming accepted as the right thing to do, entirely independent of the quantity and quality of empirical evidence of their ability to accomplish desired goals. Now, I don't think this is true anymore. But that was, at one time, the sort of dominant model of how policing worked and other areas of governance work. In this model, science is really, let's keep those scientists out of the department. Let me give you an example of this. I don't know if you ever heard of a program called CompStat in your countries. CompStat was a program developed in New York City. It was a way of managing crime, if you like, through managing policing. It had some elements, by the way, that were built on some of the work I'll tell you about in a few minutes. Am I okay for you in terms of speed? Are you getting a little too fast? A little slower, okay. In any event, so the CompStat was a big program in New York City, and the government asked me to evaluate CompStat, and I went with the president of the Police Foundation, and we got to New York, and I walked into the commissioner's office. By the way, the commissioner of police in New York City has 45,000 police officers, right? And a skyscraper is the police headquarters. And when you go up to visit the chief or the commissioner, you get out on some high floor, and then you walk into an office, and sitting there is Teddy Roosevelt's desk. Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, was commissioner of police in New York. And then you walk in through a security detail of like 10 people, at least then. And then you sit down, this is New York City, in a room this size with 3 chairs in them, all white, you know, very modern and this type of thing. And you sit down, and I started telling the commissioner, I said, you know, you don't really have any evidence that CompStat works. I said, it's all in the newspaper, it's all in Time magazine, you've got some crime stats going down, maybe crime, it turned out it was, maybe crime is just going down generally. I said, you really need to evaluate this to see whether it works. And he turned to me and he said, David, you could only bring me bad news. Now, that's the way innovation was being developed. If I'm getting good news, who cares? But how would you like if this was a treatment for breast cancer, right? And someone told you, I don't want to check it out. How do we know it doesn't make things work? How do we know it doesn't harm? Well, that was the model that was dominant often in government. I suspect in many places in South America might still be governed. So what's the problem? Here's an example. Have you ever heard of Scared Straight? It's a program where young people meet prisoners, young people at risk. And they go to meet prisoners, and it's this interactive program so the prisoners are yelling and screaming. And you know what these guys look like. I mean, right? I mean, tattoos and strong and this kind of thing. And they tell them, you know, don't get involved. Look what happened to me. I'm in prison. Don't get involved in crime. It's a bad thing. And meanwhile, there's a lot of screaming and yelling and all this kind of stuff. And this program people love, right? They love this program because the young people could see, you know, what's going to happen. You're going to turn out like these guys, right? You don't want to turn out like these guys. Now, this program has been developed throughout the United States and throughout the world. And indeed, there's a A&E. Do you have A&E television? They have a program, like on A&E television, they have Scared Straight. Here's the problem. There's a systematic review from the Campbell collaboration. Both Daniel and I sit on the committee of the Campbell collaboration for crime and justice. And in this systematic review, this doesn't have a pointer, does it? In this systematic review, these are all randomized experiments of this program. This is no effect, and this is it had a deterrent effect, it was good, and this is it backfired, it was bad. You can see all the experiments show a backfire. and it's strongly statistically significant. So this is an example of the danger of the clinical experience model. It looks good, it feels good, it's kind of fun, you know, people yelling and screaming, and it's great stuff, right? Great show, but it's harmful. It's bringing more kids to the criminal justice system, involvement in crime. That is a problem. Now, Lori Robinson, who was the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs, and Jeff Solokowski, who was at the Office of Juvenile Justice in the U.S., they wrote an editorial for I think it was the Washington Post, but I didn't write it down here. They said the fact that scared straight programs are still being touted as effective, despite the stark evidence to the contrary, is troubling. In other words, this is a problem. The federal government, by the way, will not support these programs anymore, based on the evidence from the Campbell collaboration. So that's the problem of the clinical experience model. Am I saying clinical experience is bad? No, you guys all have experience. That experience is useful to you. The work I'm going to tell you about in a minute came from walking the streets with cops when I was a graduate student, in part, 30 years ago, right? It came from my experiences. Not everything is an impact evaluation, but those experiences can't act on their own. When you have evidence, hard scientific evidence, randomized experiments, this is a bad program, it should not continue to be on A&E. You should not support this in your governments. Okay, but what about evidence-based policy? How do you get a different story? First of all, new practices and policy are based on theory and scientific evidence, statistics and research. By the way, it might be combined with your experiences. Sometimes new ideas go, you know, it seems to me that, and then you look at the scientific data and the scientific evidence to see whether it supports those ideas before you go forward. And if you have that evidence, then maybe you'll try it. You field test that idea or that program in multiple settings. And as you're learning here in the work you're doing here on impact evaluation, randomized experiments are the gold standard. They provide us with the best counterfactual. They provide us with the best case of what would have happened in the same situation with the same person perhaps if we had done something different. That's what we want. We want the same person, the same situation, the same place, under conditions in which they did get treatment or they didn't, in which we treated them a different way. And randomized experiments provide you with the closest approximation to that situation. And that's why they're the gold standard. If the practice or policy is found to work and to be cost effective, it's widely diffused, but not before then. What tends to happen in government, and why? Political leaders don't last all that long, quite often, in democracies, right? Maybe in dictatorships they do, but in democracies, you don't last that long, and you want things to happen quickly, and that's understandable. But if you go too quickly, you then diffuse something on a large scale and waste a fortune of the government's money. It also could hurt people, because it may be the programs you think work, maybe they actually create harm. Okay, so here's an example of a good process. On the left you have a table that comes in part from an article I wrote recently, but it shows you that the blue line is the concentration of crime at street segments. So you can see at 5.5% of the street segments in New York, 4.5 in Seattle, 4.5 in Tel Aviv, and 4.2 in Sacramento, you have about 50% of the crime. 50% of crime at just 5% of the streets. For 25% of crime, you have about 1% of the streets across those cities. Now, I call this, by the way, the law of crime concentration. No matter where I go in larger cities, I find approximately the same proportion of streets produce approximately the same proportion of crime. In other words, about 5% of the streets produce 50% of the crime. 1% of the streets produce 25% of the crime. Well, if just 1% of the streets produce a quarter of the crime, the logic is, right, this is the basic research, the logic is, why don't we send our police to those places? And we can have a big effect on crime with a relatively efficient investment. And that's the idea of hotspots policing. Now, if you look on the right, you can see that's the first randomized experiment in this area. It was done by Lawrence Sherman from Cambridge, who I'm sure you'll come across in your work as well, and I. And what we did was we took 110 hotspots of crime, 110 hotspot streets in Minneapolis. We randomly allocated 55 to treatment and 55 to control. So there's no reason to believe, right, that those two groups are any different. And then we brought about 3 times as much police patrol to the treatment spots as the control spots. And you can see this is the control spots, crime minus the year before. You can see here is treatment. You can see for this part of the experiment up until here, up until the summer, we had a strong deterrent effect. Well, about a 20% effect. Now, so, by the way, when we did this study, there was a consensus that police could not do something about crime. And this was an important study because it showed the police could if they changed the way they worked. It's a randomized field experiment policing. It's one of the first, but now there are many. By the way, you can see in the summer things fall apart. The question is, why do things fall apart in the summer? The study was done in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In the winter, it's cold. In the summer, it's really warm. In the summer, the kids are off from school, right? And in the summer, the police go on vacation. This is not a good combination, if you ask me. I don't really understand it. Seems to me they should go, why things get better in general. That's what this slide shows you. Now, an important issue is that if you look here, this is, if you look at the third column here, you can see it has hotspot identification. This is a survey of American police departments, and you can see in police departments with 1 million population, or over 500,000, which is very larger police agencies in larger cities, almost all of them now do hotspots of identification. We did this study 20 years ago, or at least it was published 20 years ago, showing my age. But you can see now most police departments in the US have been affected. So this is a great success story for evidence-based policy. An idea based on basic research evidence, a testing of the idea initially in one city in a randomized experiment, a follow-up in a larger number of randomized studies. Of the 25 studies, about 12 or 13 are randomized, and a strong showing of effectiveness, and over that time period, a diffusion of the innovation across police departments of the US, not only the US, all over the world, actually. So, great story. So what's the problem? Why am I not stopping here? Okay? I'm not stopping here because I think that is a good story, and it's an example where science could aid in the development of evidence-based policy. But I also want to make the point that you can't just leave science to the scientists. You have to take ownership. You have to become involved. So these are cautionary tales, okay? Both from my experience. So I'm not like picking on other people. I'm going to pick on myself. Okay. So this is science in the Supreme Court of New Jersey. Why it is important to be sophisticated. What Daniel said, to have knowledge. Why is it important for you to understand what's going on? Would you accept, if you go into there are a lot of people trying to sell you things here in the street. Do you accept everything they say? No, you want to have an understanding of what the product is, etc., what's going on. So here's what happened. In the United States, as you know, the death penalty still exists for murders and serious crimes. However, the Supreme Court in the United States has told each of the individual states that carry out the death penalty that if you're going to do this, you're going to have to do it in a way that ensures that you have a fair outcome in the death penalty. Right? In other words, that you're not just putting only blacks to death, that you're doing something that relates to the seriousness of the crime and it's fair across the system. And the state of New Jersey, which is one of the more liberal states, the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's important. How do we do that? They said, let's go to scientists to help us. Great idea, right? I think it's a good idea. Let's go to scientists. And they went to a group of scientists in a large Midwestern university, who I'll go name for the moment, and they said to them, could you develop an automated scientific data system for us to see whether someone who got the death penalty should get the death penalty? Now, when they had a case and they made a decision in the case, when a Supreme Court makes a decision and puts something in the case, that's already a gigantic issue. It's a precedent, right? And in that case, in the Supreme Court put down, they used this system. Now, what the system was this. The scientists, the law professor and statistician, they developed a data system using existing data in which they said a person with these traits would get the death penalty. And they gave a certain proportion, right? They used something called logistic regression, and they gave a proportion. This person's likelihood of getting the death penalty relative to all the other people in the system based on who they were and what they did and all these other issues, that was 0.45. That was, I think, the original result of this person. So they said he got the death penalty. The scientists said he's 0.5. That's about, well, actually it was higher, like 0.6 or 0.7. He was more than likely to get the death penalty. That seems okay. You actually should give me like 2 minutes more. Okay. I'll try to get through it. 10 minutes. Okay. So he got a number, 0.60. And the Supreme Court said, yes, the scientists tell us we did the right thing. Then they started getting criticized heavily by other people. And they called me and they said, David, solve this problem for us. And it was interesting, I must say. I mean, for me, it was like a problem, like a data, if you like statistics and stuff like that. So I started reading through everything, like every document these people had ever produced. And I found this. So let me see if I can tell you quickly what this document is. Here's our fellow over here with a 60% probability of getting the death penalty, right? That's him. Now, this around here is something called a confidence interval. The confidence interval tells you, can I be, remember I said believability? It's like believability. What you want is this. You want this point estimate, and you want believability, the likelihood of that being true, to be very close. Is it very close? In other words, this is the estimate I'm getting, but the real estimate could be anywhere between 0.05 and 0.85. In other words, this, and if you look at all those estimates, they all have large confidence intervals, right? So what basically that says is that this isn't worth anything. In other words, this is no better than you taking a guess, because you can guess throw up a coin between 15 and 85. Now what happened here? 2 o'clock in the morning, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court calls me up in Israel. What is going on here, David? Oh my God, right? And we spent 2.5 hours on the phone, of which I explained to her what happened. And what happened was that they couldn't get, the science here was weak. And they put this in an appendix somewhere. Because you guys, you don't own science, right? You don't have no knowledge. I'm not going to explain it to you. And instead, they put that with a whole series of explanations. What I said to the Supreme Court justice was, well, in a journal, this might be interesting to look at. You could discuss what the problems are. But I said, if you're going to make a decision about life and death, that's not the kind of confidence I want. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is you should have knowledge. When you want to use this information, whatever, you should be taking courses from these guys to make sure that when those scientists work with you, you have a sense of what's going on. Now, you're not going to become statisticians out there, but you can gain enough knowledge to know that, yeah, we have to know some of these things. If I'm going to do this type of study, which you're not looking at now, this is what I need to know. Okay. Now, the second example is, by the way, I should note that bringing bad news is no fun. Like this Supreme Court, this chief of the Supreme Court, she was so upset because they had a precedent. And it was coming out on me, though at the end she was actually a pretty good person in many ways and found a way to keep science involved but to get rid of this system. We created another one for her. Okay. The second example I'm going to give you quickly is the Dallas Patrol Management Experiment. This is a large randomized study that you're giving me another sign? Is that okay? A large randomized study that I ran for the Police Foundation in Dallas, Texas. And this, in part, shows you what could have happened even better if the practitioners had taken ownership. So let me show you a bit about it. So here's what we wanted to do. In Dallas, Texas, about 25% of police time is unallocated, of patrol officers. In other words, doing nothing. I don't mean eating, coffee breaks, going to court. I mean sitting there doing nothing. You might call, in this audience I can say, it's like the donut syndrome. I mean donuts, right? I don't say that in the police when I talk to the police. But anyway, 25% of their time is unallocated. In 11 weeks, this is how much time you would get in each of the types of areas. We looked at 4 types of areas, and you can see that it's like 60,000 or 70,000 hours in 11 weeks or so. In other words, like your government, you'd say, man, 60,000 hours of crime prevention. That's how I look at it. 67 hours of crime prevention. So what I saw was, how do we utilize this? So I said, you know what? Every police car in Dallas and most cities in America has a GPS. So you can know exactly where the police are, right? I said, well, why don't we provide that information to the managers, to the people that are running things, lieutenants and the captains. And maybe they could do a better job at getting people where they want them. The problem there, by the way, I should note, is that most unions in American cities do not want to allow the police to know that. Right? I mean, if this was invented 200 years ago, it wouldn't be a problem, but having been invented recently, people are concerned. But in Dallas, they agreed we could tell the captains where the police are. We couldn't tell them where Joe was or where Harry was, but we could tell them generally. And we ran an experiment, and I looked at hotspots. One of the things was they were sending cops to hotspots of crime. And if you look here, you can see that there's a significant difference. The control group had the treatment group had more patrol, right? About 25% more patrol. In other words, this system helped them get the police to the hotspots. You could see that they also reduced crime. In the control group is about 20% or 25% more crime than the treatment group. Great success for science. Another hotspots experiment, moving in the right direction. But no, and here's why not. Right, it is a success for science. In terms of learning, you can use AVL to get the police where you want them. That's an important piece of knowledge. But this is the total crime in those 4 areas during the study. This is the amount of crime that was deterred by our experiment. So even though it's a science success, from the perspective of the managers of the city, well, I'm not getting very much deterrence. However, I should know it didn't cost very much. So it may still be worthwhile, but I didn't get very much deterrence. Well, why didn't I get very much deterrence if there's a 20% or 25% reduction of crime at the hotspots? Well, this is the amount of unallocated patrol that there is, and this is the amount they use for hotspots policing. In other words, they did what we wanted, but they didn't do it a lot, relatively. By the way, I created a model. This is the amount of crime in these areas, and if they had used just 1/4 of all the unallocated crime they had, based on our estimates, this is the deterrence we would have gotten. In other words, we would have reduced crime 60 or 70%. That's very hard to know because it's a model. It's not a reality. It's me trying to see what would happen. But nonetheless, the issue here is, if they would have implemented hotspots policing, they would have implemented hotspots policing using unallocated time on a large scale, they would have reduced crime in the city significantly. Now, that's not something I had thought about before this experiment. But it's something that if the city managers were thinking more about their ownership, they would have said, how can I get the most bang for my buck here? I'm going to be doing this big experiment. It's a pain. It's hard to do. Well, how can I get the most out of it? And they would have said, yeah, I got 25%. I've got about 70,000 hours. Let's try to use 15,000. By the way, we didn't know about the 70,000. We only learned about this as the experiment developed. But they knew there was a lot of time out there. So my point is simply, why is my thing not working? It's stuck. Could you move a slide forward? My point is simply that this is a case where if the practitioners and the policymakers had taken some ownership and not just said, scientists go out and do it, they could get a tremendous bang from their buck, right? So now they would have said, I don't want to do all this and not get a big outcome out of it. They would have said, how many hotspots do we have to patrol to get a 20% reduction in, with a 20% reduction of crime to get some benefit? Why don't you just move it forward? I only have like 2 or 3 more slides. Okay, stop and I'll tell you where to go next. So, coming back to what I said before, and I'm finishing even less than 5 minutes. Okay? You need to take ownership of science. That's the way that science is going to work best in the application of science to public policy, right? You need to gain knowledge. You need to value science, right? You need to see it as useful, which people here I think do. But you also need to start taking on the norms of science, right? In terms of how we conduct things, what we do, and our commitment to the truth. You need to increase your knowledge. And this is what you're doing here. This is like speaking to those people who are already doing it, right? Normally I talk about this thinking to people that haven't done it yet, but you have. But you need to do that. The more you learn, the more you know, the better you can make this work in the real world. You don't want to walk into the situation, you don't want to call someone at 3 in the morning, like that chief of the Supreme Court did in New Jersey, with, oh my God, what is going on? I already issued a precedent here. Okay, you don't want to be in that situation. And you need to take a leadership role. You need to start thinking about, how is this good for me? What do I get out of this? And you need to participate in science. When there are scientific meetings in your area, in your state, or in your country, you should go. Get to know the people. Hear what they're doing. You'll learn a lot just from those things. Become involved. And Daniel Ortega is not just working at CAF as a researcher. He gets involved in all sorts of things, both in science and in the practice of what the bank is doing. Now, I don't have time to go over this, so I'm not going to. But I'll give you a quick taste. This was something that Peter Nayrid and I did, and they said, well, how would you move a police department to a science-based paradigm, right? And what we said was, you'd have to change the education training. In police departments, education training often has nothing to do with science. They don't learn about impact evaluations. They often don't learn about what the science says about policing. They often learn about law, the law they have to carry out, etc. So you have to change quite often the education. Leadership. You can't have, as I said before, the leaders just saying, scientists could be interesting, you get a grant, you can come to me. You need to say, we need science. You need to advocate in the government. You need to tell the people, you want me to carry out effective policies? Then you have to provide me the resources to find out what the effective policies are. You have to provide me with resources to review what's going on effective policies around the world. You have to change the relationship between scientists and policymakers and practitioners. It has to be more integrated. There'll be policymakers that become scientists or learn about science to a great degree. And there'll be scientists that also spend a lot of time in the field. We call that today embedded scientists. They're embedded in your organizations. Practices have to be developed with the scientific knowledge. It's not that you throw out your experiences. It's that you bring that science to your experiences. That you recognize that experiences could lie. In the first randomized study ever done, as far as I know, in the social sciences, was done in the 1920s in crime. And it was done on the basis of delinquents. And they took a large group of delinquents, they randomly allocated some to a treatment group and the others to control. It was a very well done study, by the way. And the treatment group got camps, special programs, and when they interviewed all the people, like the social workers or the camp counselors, they all said, this program is great, this program is fantastic. And 20 years later, the treatment group had higher rates of crime than the control group. Well, how did that happen? One of the reasons they think, by the way, is the camps. They brought these kids together who were criminals in the camps, and they learned from each other. And finally, investment in research. And this is often the hardest thing. It's not just for the National Science Foundation to invest in research. Research is important to you. So your organization, the government, you have to think like businesses do, that a certain proportion of all your funding should go for research. You can understand what the outcomes are of those fundings, etc. In any case, I think I've hopefully made the point. Science is not just something out there you invite in. You guys need to take ownership of science or become one of the owners. That will help you to develop science in a way that most advances what you want. By the way, in my view, it's also going to help science. We'll get the best science out of this kind of approach. Anyway, thank you very much.